Hi, everyone, and welcome to Module 3 of our Mindset and Mindfulness Masterclass. You know me, I'm Cassia Gandhi, Academic Affairs Director here at D2L, and I'm joined by Dr. Christy Ford, our newest D2L Masterclass Facilitator and our VP of Academic Affairs. Dr. Ford has more than 20 years of cumulative experience in higher education, secondary education, project management, program evaluation, training, and student services in the US and African continent. So we're thrilled to have her join us here today. So Christy, I know you and I both did Carol Dweck's growth versus fixed mindset self-assessment. What was your mindset, and did it surprise you at all?
Yeah, Cassie, I'm really glad you asked the question. It didn't actually surprise me, but what did surprise me is when I did the mindset assessment, how I could use it to transform my teams. So as I think about being a program chair and the process of being a chief academic officer at a university, I started to use the mindset assessment for all of my leaders to really push them and stretch them and grow them as they start to think about how they lead. How do they think about leadership opportunities for themselves? How are they developing talent on their teams? And so I think for me, it was really profoundly helpful and impactful to use that tool to be able to grow teams and to use it as a leadership tool. So I was really surprised by that because after reading Carol Dweck's work and thinking about students, I didn't think about the transformational power of how I could use it as a leader.
I love that. I found the same from a practitioner standpoint. When I first did my mindset years ago, as an educator, I had this sense that I should have 100% of a growth mindset because that was equated to being a good teacher. And when I did the survey and realized I actually have a growth mindset, but I do have some fixed tendencies, it was really good reflective activity for me to understand there are some things where I do have more of a fixed mindset. And how that impacted my practice was there were certain things that I was scared to teach. And one of them was definitely music class because I didn't feel comfortable in teaching that subject area. So that helped me to understand and apply that to the work I was doing with my students and kind of rethink how I was approaching both my career, but also the students in my classroom.
I love that, Cassie. And one of the things I'll jump in and say, as you were talking about the practitioner approach, I found at institutions that the innovators, those that are on the fringes, that are your catalysts to help you be successful in making some of those transitions into the online environment or the hybrid environment, some of those individuals, as I've thought about their characteristics, have some of those growth mindset approaches to that work. And so I think as practitioners, we also need to take that work into that vein as well.
Absolutely. There's a really good webinar that I was able to do with a couple of different school districts across the states back at the kind of midpoint of the COVID-19 pandemic on exactly that growth mindset and what that looked like in their districts, in their schools, from not only the student perspective, from the teacher perspective, as they tried to adapt and embrace new ways of teaching. We'll link it in the resources part of this class, but it did help me to really look at growth mindset from a different perspective.
I love that.
So one of the other things that I found really interesting when exploring mindset and mindfulness was this research that the Boston Research Collaborative is putting together. And they're doing an entire series of research. They have so far released 2 studies. Both were pre-COVID. So the late kind of end of 2018, 2019, but they are working on additional work to really understand mindfulness, mindset, and what are the practical applications in the K-12 classrooms. Mm-hmm. One of the studies that we talked about a bit in Module 1 was this very small research study they did in a group of middle schoolers in a Boston public school over an 8-week time period. So a bit of a small closed study, but they were looking at coding classes versus mindfulness classes. And the reason why they chose those two is there's this sense that coding is going to help students to think in new ways. It's going to help students to approach challenges in new ways. And it really is this kind of fundamental piece of a lot of our STEAM and STEM programs in K-12 classrooms. So they decided to do this study where over 8 weeks, half of this middle school class did coding classes and half of the middle school class went and did mindfulness classes. And at the end of the 8 weeks, they studied the results of these classes in two ways. One was they had students self-reflect on some social emotional learning competencies and how they felt as their mindset towards approaching challenges in the classroom. And the other way was they had students actually go through MRIs, those who were signed off and had permission to do so. And they studied the brain reaction to stressful stimuli to see what occurred. And what they found was the students who did the mindfulness classes both had a better mindset towards learning and challenges, but also had less impact, less reaction in their amygdalas to stressful stimuli. So I found this fascinating because this is something where mindfulness-based interventions are starting to become a lot more prevalent in the classroom, as are other ways of building mindset like coding classes. So I'm curious, what's your reflection on this kind of research?
Yeah, I love how you talked about the intersectionality between mindset and mindfulness. And I think that what we know in short is that students who believe that the skills and intellect that they possess can be improved with intentional practice, what we also know from the research study is that those individuals do better in school, because no longer are we teaching this notion, or they believe in this notion that inborn talent is the thing that's going to get me ahead. And so more specifically, individual students in PK-12 and higher ed tend to seek challenges and really perceive setbacks as opportunities rather than threats. And I think in this culture that we live in that is social media rich, everything contextually is being cataloged and recorded. Students worry about image. And so with this different approach, you worry less about image and more about the learning. And so I think it's really intentional to be able to think about those kinds of research studies that are coming out, because I think it gives practitioners a way to really be able to crack this code in current day.
I agree. And I think there's so much benefit to approaching mindset and MIB kind of teaching in the classroom, but there's also some risk involved and some things that I think we should critique a bit. So when I was doing some research for this masterclass, I came across this really interesting article by Learning for Justice, which is an organization that really looks at equity and justice in the classroom. And they cautioned that if we start using mindfulness as an intervention without a lens of equity, we run into this risk where we approach any student who has anxiety in the classroom, who doesn't feel included in the classroom, who perceives a negative climate in the classroom, as just someone who needs their mindset shifted, or someone who needs a bit more mindfulness training, and just kind of breathe through it and you'll be fine. And that completely undermines any of the actual challenges or problems that are happening within our school systems that create those feelings for specific groups of students. So I'm really curious, from your perspective, what does it look like when we do mindfulness as a Band-Aid solution in the classroom?
Yeah, I think that's a good question for consideration. I think that what we are seeing now more so in classrooms as well are individuals who need a little bit more support with mental health challenges. And so one of the articles and research that I'm really familiar with really talks about cautioning us and not using this Band-Aid approach, and that we have to be really careful with students who have mental health issues and histories of trauma. Those students may not be the best candidates for mindfulness meditation in classroom setting. You may need to be thinking about what mental health practitioners are available in your school, what are other resources and supports to be able to do that programmatically in a really relevant way. And I think as we talk about marginalized groups of individuals, it's really also important to think about the cultural context. And so, anyone who is trying to overcome injustices or systemic oppressions, just having a growth mindset isn't going to make that approach and that shift happen. And so, as we think about stereotype, by its very definition in nature, it implies that it's an immutable flaw, and that in itself is fixed. And so I think that as we talk a little bit more today, I really hope we can also think about, are there ways to be able to use these tools and technologies to think about diversity, equity, inclusion as well. I think that there are some really good takeaways and some thoughtful things that we can work on.
I agree. And I'm curious too, from a mindset perspective, when we look at that framework and how it impacts the work we do in the classroom or the lecture hall, what do you think are the practical applications or the practical ways we need to approach this as practitioners?
So I have a couple. The first, I think, is really as new research comes out around this implementation strategy, we can't use it as a silver bullet, right? We have to be so thoughtful that mindfulness practices should never be mandatory. You know, as I talked about those youngsters who have had active traumatic events in their lives, meditation can activate those memories and thoughts for some children. And so teachers need to be prepared for this and understand that mindfulness can mean acknowledging negative emotion and giving students an opportunity to process them, but also giving students an opportunity to opt out if they don't feel comfortable in the middle of a session. So I think the first piece is that this is not a one-all, this is not a panacea, that it can't be mandatory for all students. I think the other thing we have to remember as we think about mindset on the other side of the coin is that we have to remember that there's no monolith in terms of how we approach and we apply growth mindset. We need to think about protocols and develop specific protocols that are specific to culturally adapted mindfulness practices and interventions. And so we have some research that we'll put and we'll link in the module here. But groups of marginalized individuals need their concerns considered beyond this universal notion of human suffering. That limits the ability to really pay specific and unique attention to race-related concerns that contribute to harmful effects of people of color. And so I think those are the first two that I think I'd offer, is to really, proceed with caution, but also proceed knowing that this is not, a silver bullet in how we use these approaches.
Awesome. And one of the things that we'll link as a resource for everybody as well is some of Christy's thinking around fixed mindset and growth mindset in mathematics and how we think about DEI. So we'll make sure that you have that as well. So I know we're at time. Thank you, Christy, for sharing your ideas and insights and wisdom today. Really appreciated the time together.
Great to have the time with you, Cassia. Thanks so much.